Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar where we're going to be unpacking the insights from our latest research. Today, I'm joined by James Massey, Managing Director for FM Energy and Retail Intelligence, and Carl Broom, who's our Senior Director for FM and Energy at MRI Software. So today, we're going to be taking a look at some of the insights from our latest research. We're going to be looking at AI ambitions versus the realities of implementing them. We're going to look at how technology appetite remains strong for the sector, and then go into efficiency, compliance, and sustainability. We're then going to wrap up the session with a small piece on smarter buildings and how predictive maintenance technologies are supporting FM today. Today, we celebrate World FM Day, and it's the perfect moment to recognise and celebrate the essential role that facilities managers play globally in keeping our environments running smoothly. This year's research looks beyond the technology hype to understand how FM teams are really experiencing AI, data, and digital transformation. And this conversation leans into insight rather than instruction. Over the next 45 minutes, we're going to look at what the data tells us about where the sector's moving, where it's getting stuck, and what that means for the future of facilities management. Facilities management is operating in one of the most complex environments it's ever faced, balancing compliance, sustainability, and cost pressures, as well as skills gaps, cybersecurity, and how organisations are accelerating technology transformation. To understand how FM professionals are navigating this, we surveyed 188 UK-based FM leaders across a wide range of sectors and portfolio sizes. The result is a picture of a sector that's ambitious and increasingly technology aware, but also candid about the obstacles holding progress back. The respondents represent a broad cross-section of the UK FM industry, from education and healthcare to property management and financial services. What's important here is the diversity of scale. Over half manage fewer than 5 sites, but a meaningful proportion oversees large, complex portfolios. That variation has a real impact on technology readiness, data maturity, and investment confidence. The skills gap within FM was flagged by around 42% of respondents. And this chart explains some of the reasoning behind this, as it reveals an ageing workforce with over half of respondents aged over 40. Closing this gap will likely mean investing in training programs for those already in the profession as technology continues to evolve at a rapid rate, but also apprenticeship schemes and investment in the latest technologies to attract a younger generation. With this also comes a cultural and mindset shift as organisations embrace change. So let's start with AI. One of the most revealing findings is how respondents rate AI's importance, and this is rated at an average score of 5 out of 10. Facilities managers understand the potential of AI, but most organisations are not yet data ready. And that suggests that FM has moved past scepticism, but it hasn't yet reached strategic commitment. So James, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I think it's clear that AI is the next large-scale revolution akin to the Industrial Revolution. I think that's pretty obvious now to where that is. People are beginning to understand some of the capabilities and some of the power it can bring into real life. You know, we are taking our platforms from, I would say, systems of record to systems of decisions. Where AI can help, and we'll talk about this through the conversation with things like agentic AI that Carl will cover off later on, is around bringing together some of those powerful data sets, of course, that our systems have in there. But actually, it starts with that, and we'll use that as a golden thread throughout this conversation, Jenny, which is, without good data, you are not making good decisions. And actually, my commentary there that says system of record to a system of decision is super relevant. We've been on this journey in MRI with MRI Agora, which is our principal integration architecture and data lake and data platform, bringing together all those connection sets. So I think where organizations are going to start to see this come to fruition is when organizations start to draw value. And in fact, during this conversation, we'll give you some examples of that for people to go away and consider. I think as well, we've got to make sure that AI is not an answer looking for a question. I'm sure that the technology can do everything that organizations want. And in fact, we're more used to using AI now in our own lives and our own personal lives, for example. But actually, understanding what it's trying to fix, I think, is one of the key points, Jenny. And again, we'll come to some of those as we go through this conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. So that leads us nicely into the data readiness piece. More than half of respondents lack confidence that their FM data is robust enough to support AI or automation. Only 5% say they're very confident, and 1 in 5 don't measure FM performance at all. And this reinforces a key message that AI success isn't about algorithms first, it's about having connected, reliable, and trusted data. So, James, Carl, what does good data actually mean for FM teams in practice?
I think good means enough. I think it means having enough good data to make decisions on. Data quality is critical, and Carl will cover some of those points off in a moment. But actually, it's about having the right amount of data. Don't overgather, don't undergather. If you want to use the Goldilocks phrase, you want just enough data to make that point. I think validation at point of entry is so important now, because actually, as we gather more and more data, and we'll talk about smart buildings later on in this conversation, you're going to be gathering huge amounts more data, huge amounts more information and to act upon, which is great. But you've got to put a proper data management structure around that. And I think it's some of the challenges that organizations face is just the volume of, you can become snowblind with the amount of data that organizations gather. We know that in our own lives on a daily basis. So it's about having good, actionable data, the right amount, but clean, concise, actionable data. Carl, what's your comments on that?
Well, I mean, I totally agree with everything you just said there, really, James. But I think for me, it's about the understanding. The industry has understood how valuable the data now is that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. I think there has to be, with FM technology, a good grounding of structured data, which means that we are aligning to the standards of the FM industry, whether that's British standards, compliance standards, statutory standards, ISO standards. These controls need to be built into the FM technology to give the foundation for actually what good data equals. So I think with that is giving us a platform now to operate from, but there is still some work to be done.
Yeah, and I think you talk about compliancy and standardization. We have lots of organizations use products like SFG20, which of course are standardized solutions for all intents and purposes, but it's actually how we take that data and then make it actionable. And then that's some of the key points there. And another thing, Jenny, as well, is there are still organizations, many organizations, who have data outside of systems of decision. So they could well be in a spreadsheet, they could be in another system that's disconnected from that. And I think actually you say that this reinforces the message that AI success isn't about algorithms, it's about connected, reliable and trusted data. Actually, it's got to be a holistic data set, because if you've got data sitting in external systems, how can you action that? You've got to make sure those things are all in one single system, because actually if you've got siloed data sat to one side, how are you making sure that's brought into the conversation?
So that leads us nicely into the topic of agentic AI, which is an area that we deliberately explored in this research. Agentic AI is where systems don't just generate insight, but they can act autonomously within defined parameters. It's a concept that's getting a lot of attention in the wider technology landscape. But when we look at the data here, familiarity within facilities management is still relatively low. Over half of respondents told us they're not familiar with agentic AI at all, and only a small proportion feel very familiar with it. This creates an interesting dynamic. On one hand, FM professionals clearly expect automation and AI to play a much bigger role in the next 5 years. On the other, some of the more advanced forms of AI are still very much on the horizon for day-to-day practice. So this is less about what FM should be doing immediately and more about understanding what's coming. And also what needs to be in place before more autonomous systems can be trusted. Carl, I'll come over to you. When you look at these findings, how do you see agentic AI fitting into the future of FM? And what needs to happen first before FM teams can realistically and confidently engage with more autonomous AI systems?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I think with agentic AI, we're seeing this move and the shift from being able to assist to then act. So with that comes a lot of trust. And I think with that trust needs to be more established within the industry for there to be greater adoption and also recognition as well of the technology. And I think for me, with FM being such a people business, the value really needs to be recognized to the business, but also to the value. What value is agentic AI actually going to bring? And as you mentioned earlier, James, understanding we are implementing the technology for the sake of solving a problem, and we're not looking to try and solve that somewhere else or a problem that doesn't actually exist. So I think really to understand that and to build that trust will then start to see the further adoption within the industry. I think for me, that's how it's going to play out.
Yeah, I think it's the use cases that it's looking to do. If we're looking at, I don't know, maybe that's autonomous contact centers using AI chatbots, which has been around now for some time. But actually now that actual taking it from something more than just an email, for example, to actually a transaction happening, I think is going to become more and more and more prevalent in the markets. When we look at how to streamline a process, digitization is probably the answer to that particular question. I think actually agentic AI can add such value if thoroughly mapped out. But also we must remember as well, at all these stages, there must always be I would say an analog channel as well for service, because not everybody is going to want to use these points. So I think we need to consider whether that's front office, back office, and what that's really going to interact with. I think those points are really important. Let's make sure that we don't just make things digital only, because you don't want to digitally exclude people. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, that is a good point. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And actually that leads us nicely into the foundations that need to exist. So before agentic AI can become a practical reality in FM, the research suggests there's an important conversation to be had about foundations. Autonomous systems, by definition, rely on a high degree of trust, not just in the technology itself, but also in the data that's feeding it, the rules that are guiding it, and the oversight that sits around it. What came through strongly in the report is that these foundations are not yet consistently in place across the sector. Data confidence remains low for many organisations. Governance structures vary widely, and accountability for AI-driven decisions is still evolving. So rather than seeing agentic AI as a near-term destination, it's probably more helpful to think of it as a direction of travel, one that depends on getting some fundamentals right first. So Carl, when we talk about agentic AI in FM, why are these foundations so critical, and what risks do organisations face if they try to move towards autonomy before these basic foundations are in place?
So I think what any AI strategy must start with is leadership. It must start from the very top of an organization, because people read in the press all the time about the horror stories of AI losing jobs, and so on and so forth. So actually a true AI strategy across an organization, be that agentic or be that otherwise, must start with leadership. I think that's really important there. So the human oversight and accountability, I think, is critical at the very, very top of the tree. You must then go down then to security, so the clear governance and controls. When we start to trust systems more and be far more autonomous, we must ensure that the right security is wrapped around there. We are dealing with potentially people and facilities in people's own personal lives, etc., and what we do. And of course, or other national infrastructure platforms. I think what's really important, there's a security that sits around there, because actually without robust security, what do the risks look like? You would not base any decisions in your own lives unless you generally understood the full facts. And I think that's really important here. I think when we say trusted connected data, what we're actually saying there is, do we have all the facts at our fingertips? Do we have as much information as physically possible there to make a considered decision? And how do we ensure the fact that AI, agentic AI in this particular part of the scenario here, uses all of those points there? So it has the guardrails of human oversight, it has the guardrails of security, and it has the guardrails of data. And I think those 3 points, if you can do that properly, clearly, and consistently, I think consistency is absolutely critical there. Because what you don't want to do is to have one grade A1 perfect system and then something else that isn't, that then interacts with it, because you start then to breach what that looks like. That cleanliness is absolutely critical in there. So the question is why agentic AI depends on strong foundations, because it needs strong foundations to do that. It is a paradigm shift to move away from what we do now to something that's far more automated. And actually, when we look back in history, things like moving away from in-person banking to online banking, that was so many years in the planning just to get to a point where you can even look at bank statements online, because actually, would you have ever trusted an online banking platform that didn't have all the trust fundamentals in place? Online banks are around since the 80s, now more like the 1990s now. People now trust it, but they only trust it because of everything that goes around it. So, for me, I think it's critical that these foundations are in place. I think organizations need to invest in the foundations, and then they need to continually invest as well in things like governance and oversight and accountability, and continue to invest as well in the data. And I'm going to talk about that in a little while, but actually for me, it's making sure that you continually base decisions on the right amount of data with the right rules around it. And actually, moreover, it's a continuous review process as well. But I think you've always got to have that oversight. Maybe you want to comment on some of that points.
Yeah, I think what you just said there, though, it's a continuously evolving exercise. I think, we often see that technology gets established within an organisation. It can be left to its own devices, basically. And I think that also plays into a point we'll talk about later around that continuous investment piece. And I think it's not just investment, but it's also the continued governance. The guardrails that you talk about, how we make sure that we're, the AI and whatever technology it is not producing the perceived hallucinations that it might be that people are worried about.
Yeah.
And then the actual fact, when we're dealing with mission critical services within FM, we've got to be sure that the output's correct. And I think with all of those guardrails that you mentioned there, that's what's going to keep the output honest.
Yeah, fully agree.
Excellent. Thank you both. So that wraps up the AI section really nicely. We now look at the appetite for technology still remaining strong. So what this research revealed was that there's still strong intent to invest in technology. But again, the certainty lags behind. 57% of those surveyed expect to adopt new FM technology in the next 12 to 18 months, but only 17% say that that's definite. So here's my question to you both. What proof points do decision makers need before committing to new FM technology?
I think what's really important here is looking back at where projects have made a difference to an organization. People want to make investments into technology, be that software, be that hardware, be that a combination thereof, where it's going to make a difference to their organizations. We all understand, of course, that FM is a person-centric, service-centric, but also cost-sensitive space. And actually, I think decision makers need to be convinced of the fact that it's going to make a difference to one of those key points. Is it going to improve their customer service? Is it going to improve the potentially the timeline or lifespan of their assets? Or is it going to improve their operating margin, for example? So I think be able to show people where it's going to make a difference. One point that is key is, and suppliers such as ourselves, or I should say partners such as ourselves, is, we like to be on this journey for a long time with organizations. It is a massive job to change any IT system. We all understand that. What's really important for us is to set out the ground rules as to where we need to get to, understanding the question that we're trying to answer. It's about understanding what the baseline is as well. I think those things are really important, Jenny. Understanding what the baseline is and then what the improvement factor then looks like across those particular points. So if I summarize it, it would be down to what are we trying to improve? Is it going to be customer service, lifespan of an asset, and or operating margin across those particular points? It's about how we can convince an organization that we are a partner of choice. I think those things are really important. a CAFM system, which of course is what we primarily talk about in this conversation, is a continuous investment, though. It is not a simple tick in a box. It is something that organizations need to understand they need to continually invest in. That's not necessarily meaning invest in, keep spending money with a supplier. Of course, we understand how that model works, but actually, and I think, Carl, you'd agree with this, some of the best projects that we've seen, in fact, me and you were on site with a large manufacturer last week, are the ones where they have internal champions. So the internal investment in products is almost as important as the external investment in products. Maybe you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I think the more successful projects and ongoing partnerships that we have is that internal investment, that internal ownership, that system champion who's going to continuously drive operational excellence from a systems perspective, but also internally from an FM delivery. That's where we start to see long-term relationships and partnerships grow. And I think one other point as well, just for other people to consider, is that when you are speaking to potential partners, it's about understanding their roadmap capabilities. Now, everyone can produce a fantastic roadmap, but actually ask the question about, well, if you look back in time, what has actually been delivered from that roadmap? And things will change, but you're looking for a consistent delivery of technology, of improvements to that software and that technology over time as well. I think that's an important part.
Yeah, no, fully agree. So if we summarize it, it's a choose the right partner. It's a long-term relationship. Choose a partner who would want to, who you can sort of see has got the same strategic ambitions there to drive forward innovation, but always consider the fact that it is not just a tick box exercise implementing one of these systems. It is groundbreaking if it's done right, but there is a need for a continuous investment in it, be that internally or be that externally.
Excellent, thank you. So let's look at the other side of that then. What is holding investment back? What's interesting here is that resistance to technology itself isn't the issue. The barriers are practical. Cost, as we've discussed, remains one of the biggest obstacles, followed by integration complexity and capability gaps. These aren't ideological objections, they're execution risks. So how can organisations reduce that perceived risks? Is there a combination of pilots, phased rollouts, business cases? What can organisations do here?
I think they need to, working with suppliers potentially before procurement, is to understand, as I said in the previous part of this conversation, is around what problem are we trying to fix there? Cost remains the biggest obstacle. Actually, is it cost or is it just not understanding the value? There's a great quote from Warren Buffett that says, cost is what you pay for something, value is what you get from it, which I think is absolutely critical. I think understanding integration complexity, if we consider what that really means, is that because an organization may have disconnected data sets that we can then potentially help them with? And again, as I said at the very beginning of this conversation, you must have a holistic data set across the board to ensure you're making decisions based upon a complete picture. The capability gaps point is interesting. Of course, I spend a lot of time talking to organizations about feature functions, strategic sides of roadmaps, and so on and so forth. I think it's always an interesting point when someone said that there's feature function gaps in a product without us necessarily understanding what that point is there. So I think actually, Jenny, to answer your question there, I think a business case that lays out clearly what the issue is, and then organizations then respond clearly then with what that particular answer is critical. I do think phase rollouts versus a big bang approach is again interesting. I've got experience of doing both of those points. I think sometimes phase rollouts work better if it's a fairly new product and a new business and so on and so forth. Other ones want to go whole hog in one hit. And then pilot projects, I think, Carl, you'd agree. Sometimes pilot projects can go well where organizations want to do it, but organizations have to put the time into a pilot project and they need to commit their time. Maybe you want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think with pilot projects, it can be a bit of a mixed bag. I think sometimes with pilot projects, you end up putting as much effort in as you would do moving into a normal project. Yeah. So, I mean, typically speaking, if you've done the necessary validation against the product and your new prospective partner, then great. A phase rollout could help you to ease that transition of the product into your business. But also as well, let's not forget the change management piece around the people aspect that goes alongside that.
I think that's a really important point there. Is it's a change. If you're going to do anything, if you're going to move a service to a digitized service, that's a change. It's a change for either the staff and or the consumer. It's one of those 2 points, or maybe even both. I think actually a robust communication plan throughout is critical. And I've obviously got experience in many of these projects there. The ones I think that have done the best are the ones that have a good, clear communication strategy set out internally from the outset.
Totally agree with you here.
Thanks both. No, I appreciate the honest response there. So we're now going to have a look at what is driving automation. When organisations do invest, the motivations are very clear. Here we can see efficiency and productivity dominate. Nearly 80% cite this as the main reason to adopt new technologies. AI matters, but primarily as a means to an end. It improves efficiency, it reduces manual effort, and it enables better decisions. So a question for you both. In your many years in the sector, which FM processes have you seen deliver the fastest return when automated?
Yeah, me and Carl have been around for quite some years, me slightly more than him actually now. I think the single biggest thing that I would say in the last 25 years in this vertical is around mobile working. I don't think there's anything else that's actually been quite as groundbreaking and quite as process shifting as mobile working, because actually going from that, and back in the mid-90s when I was working in a local authority, it was still paper job cards. Whereas now nobody would do that. Now everything now has a smartphone or equivalent tablet. So I think actually the migration to online for the engineers, operatives, etc., has become probably the biggest thing that I've ever seen. And I think actually as well the biggest ROI ever would be around mobile working. Maybe then the next one then is potentially the same thing then, but for the ultimate consumer. So for the tenants, the residents, etc., then their move then online has become that, and then probably then dynamic scheduling in some spaces in which we operate in, more around the responsive maintenance. But I don't think anything has ever been as big as mobile working and digitization of services. If we then drive that then going forwards now, there is a huge push, of course, towards ESG sustainability. And actually, we're seeing a big tie-in with sustainability onto FM. Carl, do you want to talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I think we've traditionally seen the two teams, FM and energy, very much sit in silos, albeit they might be in the next room. We have started to uncover the fact that technology needs to bring these teams together. The integration of that technology set really, I think, spells out in the data that we've received back here, because the combination of FM and energy means that an actual change can be made to the workplace, and there can be a greater impact in terms of how assets are behaving, how they're operating, and the impact that has in terms of energy savings, energy consumption, and the way in which we are now able to report on sustainability and performance as well. So I think the combination of those two systems and data sets mean that we can push that further forward, again, within the workplace.
Yeah. So sustainable FM.
Yeah.
Which is probably what you'd want to phrase. I think really interesting.
Excellent, thank you. So actually that might lead us nicely into smarter buildings and predictive maintenance. This is where AI and automation really stand out. We can see that it's no longer experimental, it's increasingly seen as a credible operational improvement. The combination of AI, asset data, and monitoring technologies creates opportunities to shift from reactive fixes to planned interventions. So how can organisations balance innovation with reliability and compliance? And when does the phrase smart become business as usual in FM?
Yeah, I mean, we're about half an hour into this presentation now, and I haven't once mentioned IoT, which is quite a thing. I firmly believe that the IoT, Internet of Things, smart sensors, smarter buildings has a huge role to play. The smart elements of smart FM is very much that, and I know we're going to talk in a moment about footfall driven maintenance, but actually as buildings become retrofitted as new builds go up. We're currently sat in the middle of London. There's building work all around here happening. I think the sensor data we can now get from a building is becoming more and more and more actionable.
Absolutely.
There are sensors. In fact, this building that me and Carl are sat in currently is flooded with sensors. We know huge amounts of data about this particular building. Actually, we've used that to make a difference in terms of how we operate and use this facility. So I think smart becomes BAU in facilities management when it becomes the standard part of a building fabric. But also, I think it's a trust point, isn't it? If we actually go back in the supply chain, when organizations are producing tenders to request hard or soft FM services, they're still quite standard how they operate. They're still quite traditional. That's a better word to use. And actually, if we're going to start deploying more smart technology, has the supply chain further up that chain got to adapt the way that it asks this questions? We're lucky we help lots of organizations with tender responses, but they are still quite traditional. So actually, I think bringing some of those smarter things into that is key. There's been so many pilots though of IoT over the years, which me and you have been part of, and I think the technology has proven. I think it's about the trust of what that can do. But maybe you want to comment more.
I mean, there's always been this constant drive and talk of innovation within the industry that's been in demand for years and years and years, and I think IoT was seen as that enabler of that, but we didn't really see a lot of that. I think the pilots, like you say, we've been involved in for years, that they do deliver, but then there's never that sort of further appetite to take that further. And I think with the advent of AI and the ability for it to crunch the data, to put it like that, the actual lift and shift of all of that data that IoT sensors and BMS systems can actually collect or produce, and then we can collect. I think AI is going to help us to decipher that. And I actually think, in my opinion, that the role of the FM will then start to be a little bit more analytical, because we're able to produce them with the statistics that they've never been able to see before, and they can then make those informed decisions like they've never been able to before either. And a lot of that will come down purely driven from the AI and the ability for that tool to actually produce that. So it's a changing landscape for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's dig deeper into a topic that is close to my heart, footfall. Footfall-driven maintenance, this is in the FM space, not retail. It's clearly growing interest within the sector, but adoption is still relatively low. So, James and Carl, from your perspective, what do you think is holding organisations back, and what needs to change for this footfall-driven maintenance to move from an interesting idea to standard practice within FM?
Yeah, just so we explain when we say footfall-driven maintenance, I think the core principle there is the fact that we can put a counter or utilize an existing camera in an area, in a space, and we can understand just how many people have been past that particular area. So actually counting footfalls to in and out of a particular area. What is really important there, Jenny, is the previous point that me and Carl raised out, which is a lot of maintenance contracts and contractors still operate in a fairly traditional way, which is where for many, many years and is, of course, well received. The difference with this then is actually doing, for example, cleaning services based upon usage. Let's say it's in a hospital or a school or whatever it needs to be, as opposed to just doing a 2-hour clean because that's what they need to do. Let's start to have the conversation about, can we shift that there based on how many people have actually been past that area? Let's look at, say, is there any point to cleaning that toilet when nobody's used it in the last sort of 2-3 hours? The reverse of that, of course, let's say there's been 300 people in and out of a toilet in an A&E department in the last hour, maybe that one should be cleaned more frequently. So I think it's about how footfall data can start to drive an action somewhere further down the FM chain then to go away from that kind of standard cyclical maintenance. And we've had some wonderful conversations with this with organizations, and again we utilize that in this building. It's helped us to understand just how each floor works, which days are the busiest days. We're recording this today on a Monday. Footfall is fairly low in the City of London today. And actually is generally low in offices and most offices that we frequent. I think the difference and the adoption of it going from an interesting idea to standard practice. Again, the use case and the proof of the pudding is in eating. I think that phrase kind of always works. Maybe you want to comment some more on that.
Well, I think it starts to help establish patterns of data, doesn't it? Patterns of behaviour. And I think that's key in the way in which the built environment and our buildings are being utilised at the moment. And that, along with that comes the maintenance aspect, whether that's hard or soft services. So really, this is another tool that I think the industry can rely on to understand how that works. You mentioned healthcare, for example. That is in a huge area of interest at the moment for us, where organisations are coming to us to understand how this can help them, like you said, in an A&E department, where they need to redirect resource to the right areas. So again, it's helping to drive that operational efficiency.
But it is, as you say, another data set, though, to make informed decisions on. That's the point. It's about understanding how an asset is being utilised. And if we look at, asset rationalisation that's happening in a number of areas now, this sort of idea will start to give a far better idea about how an asset is being utilised, an asset being an office or whatever that needs to be. So more to come, I would say, Jenny, but really, really keen to work with people on what the capability of this is.
Exciting things, definitely. Thank you. And as we look ahead, we can see here that the direction of travel is very clear. Smart technologies and automation dominate expectations alongside sustainability and data-driven decision-making. But the future is also more complex, with cybersecurity and governance becoming integral parts of FM, not just distant concerns. So with this in mind, what's the one area organisations need to fix first in order to move forward with confidence?
I think for me, Jenny, the area of trust in a number of areas, really, but also understanding where the problems lie. I think we need to make sure, organisations need to make sure they understand what the problems are that they're fixing here, and also making sure that they've got the trust within their own data and what that looks like, but also as well that they're talking to a partner that can help them improve that delivery as well. For me, that's one area I think where we can help people move forward with confidence.
And I think you referenced cybersecurity in the question, Jenny. There is so much in the press around where cybersecurity's gone wrong. Nobody ever references where it's gone well. It's always where it's gone wrong.
It just happens.
And it just happens. Yeah, it's like an insurance policy, isn't it? And actually we pride ourselves in our cybersecurity offering here as MRI. So I think organisations again need to be clear the fact that if they entrust their data and their processes, and as we move to things like agentic AI and IoT and footfall and energy and all of those tech stacks that we've talked about during this conversation, I think governance and security are the two critical pillars in that particular space. And again, we can talk to organisations there with confidence about what we've done, but also take them on the journey with it. Again, it's a huge thing and a huge decision to implement these systems. And again, we've talked about agentic AI and a number of points in here, but it's critically important to decision makers the fact that they trust the supplier, they trust the data, and they know that the security is wrapped around it. Because actually, it takes years to build a business, which only ever takes one bad news story to ruin a business. And I think, again, that's so important.
Of course, it is that reputation piece. No, thank you both for that. As we wrap up this conversation, it's clear to see that the FM sector is aligned on direction, an approach that is smarter, more data-oriented and more automated. The challenge lies in execution, not intent. And success depends on having the right data foundations in place, ensuring there's integration amongst key solutions and maintaining progress. What this research highlights is a profession that is thoughtful, ambitious and pragmatic. The next phase of facilities management won't be defined by the many technologies that exist and the evolution of AI, but by how effectively organisations prepare themselves to use it. So I want to say a big thank you to James and Carl for joining us today, for leading the conversation on the latest research. And thank you to all for joining us. We hope that this insight helps inform your own conversations, priorities and decisions. This report provides a blueprint for change, and you can download your copy using the QR code on screen.